The sun blazed mercilessly over Dust Rock Valley, a small frontier town where hope seemed as scarce as water in the desert. The year was 1887, and the settlement clung to life like a dying man to his last breath. Wooden buildings lined the dusty main street, their paint peeling under the relentless Arizona sun, while tumbleweeds danced between the hitching posts like ghosts of better times. In the shadows of Miller's General Store, a small figure crouched behind wooden crates, his dark eyes scanning the street with the wariness of a hunted animal. Little Bear, as he called himself, was no more than 12 years old, but his face carried the weight of someone who had seen too much suffering for his tender age. His Apache heritage was evident in his bronze skin and jet-black hair, features that marked him as an outsider in this predominantly white settlement. "There he is!" shouted Mrs. Henderson, the banker's wife, pointing a trembling finger at the boy. "The devil child! Ever since he arrived, nothing but misfortune has befallen our town." A crowd began to gather, their faces twisted with fear and hatred. The boy pressed himself deeper into the shadows, his small hands clutching a worn leather pouch, the only thing left from his murdered family. "My chickens died the day after he showed up," complained old Pete, the chicken farmer. 23 hens all dead by morning. "And don't forget the well that went dry last week," added Sarah Mitchell, the schoolteacher. "Mark my words, that boy carries a curse." The crowd's murmur grew into an angry roar. Little Bear's heart pounded as he searched for an escape route. He had heard these accusations before, in the 3 other towns that had driven him away. Always the same story. Misfortune followed by blame, blame followed by violence. Just as the mob began to close in, the distinctive sound of spurs jingling on wooden planks cut through the noise. The crowd parted reluctantly as a tall figure emerged from the saloon. Cowboy Lonely stood 6 feet tall, his weathered face bearing the scars of countless battles and heartbreaks. At 43, he had the kind of presence that commanded respect without demanding it. His steel-gray eyes surveyed the scene with the calm of a man who had seen humanity at its worst and still chose to believe in its potential for good. "What's all this commotion about?" Lonely asked, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being heard. "It's that Apache boy, Lonely," Mrs. Henderson spat. "He's brought nothing but bad luck to our town. We need to run him out before he destroys us all." Lonely's gaze found the small figure hiding behind the crates. For a moment their eyes met, and he saw something that the others had missed. Not evil or malice, but pure, unadulterated fear. The same fear he had seen in his own reflection years ago, when he was just a boy running from his own demons. "Bad luck, you say?" Lonely stepped closer to the crowd, his hand resting casually on his gun belt. "Seems to me like you're looking for someone to blame for problems that existed long before this child arrived." "Don't you defend him!" old Pete shouted. "You don't understand what we've been through." "I understand plenty," Lonely replied, his voice growing colder. "I understand that it's easier to blame a child than to face the truth about your own failures." The crowd shifted uncomfortably. Lonely had a reputation in these parts, not as a gunslinger or an outlaw, but as a man who kept his word and protected those who couldn't protect themselves. Few were willing to cross him directly. "The boy stays," Lonely declared, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Anyone who has a problem with that can take it up with me personally." As the crowd began to disperse, grumbling and casting dark looks over their shoulders, Lonely approached the hiding spot where Little Bear remained crouched. The boy looked up at him with a mixture of gratitude and suspicion. "What's your name, son?" Lonely asked, kneeling down to the boy's level. "Little Bear," the child whispered, his voice barely audible. "Well, Little Bear, how about you come with me? I've got a cabin outside of town where you'll be safe." The boy hesitated. In his short life, kindness had been rarer than gold, and he had learned to be suspicious of anyone who offered help without asking for something in return. "Why?" Little Bear asked. "Why would you help me?" Lonely was quiet for a long moment, his mind drifting to memories he usually kept buried. "Because everyone deserves a chance, son, and because I know what it's like to be alone in this world." As they walked together toward the edge of town, neither of them noticed the figure watching from the window of the sheriff's office. Sheriff Morrison's face was grim as he observed the unlikely pair. He reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a yellowed wanted poster, studying it carefully before looking back at the departing figures. The poster bore the image of a man who looked remarkably like Cowboy Lonely, but younger. The name at the bottom read William Billy Morrison, and the reward was for murder. That evening, as Lonely prepared a simple meal in his modest cabin, Little Bear sat by the fireplace, still clutching his leather pouch. The warmth of the fire and the smell of cooking food were luxuries he hadn't experienced in months. "You don't have to be afraid here," Lonely said, setting a plate of beans and hardtack before the boy. "This is your home now, for as long as you need it." Little Bear looked up at him with eyes that seemed far too old for his young face. "They'll come for me," he said quietly. "They always do." "Not while I'm here," Lonely promised. "Not ever again." Outside, the wind howled through the canyon, carrying with it the scent of change. Neither man nor boy could have imagined that their meeting would set in motion events that would transform not just their own lives, but the entire town of Dust Rock Valley. For in the leather pouch that Little Bear guarded so carefully lay a secret that would soon shake the very foundations of everything the townspeople believed to be true. As the fire crackled and the night deepened, Cowboy Lonely made a silent vow. He had failed to protect someone once before, and that failure had haunted him for 20 years. This time would be different. This time, he would not let an innocent child pay the price for the hatred and fear of others. But in the darkness beyond the cabin walls, forces were already moving against them. The sheriff had sent word to the territorial marshal, and by morning, riders would be on their way to Dust Rock Valley. The peaceful night was merely the calm before a storm that would test every ounce of courage and conviction that Cowboy Lonely possessed. The boy was finally safe, fed, and warm. But their greatest challenges lay ahead, and the truth that would eventually set them both free was still buried in the shadows of the past. 3 weeks had passed since Little Bear found refuge in Cowboy Lonely's cabin, and slowly the boy began to emerge from his shell of fear and mistrust. Each morning, Lonely would teach him practical skills, how to tend horses, mend fences, and read the signs of changing weather. But more importantly, he showed him something the boy had never experienced before: unconditional kindness. "Hold the reins gentle-like," Lonely instructed, as Little Bear sat atop Dusty, Lonely's old mare. "A horse can sense your intentions through your touch. Treat her with respect, and she'll carry you anywhere." Little Bear's face lit up with a rare smile as Dusty responded to his gentle guidance. For the first time in his young life, he felt a sense of belonging, of purpose. The nightmares that had plagued his sleep began to fade, replaced by dreams of riding across open plains with his newfound protector. But their peaceful existence was about to be shattered. In town, Sheriff Morrison paced his office like a caged wolf. The territorial marshal's response had been swift and clear. William Morrison was wanted for the murder of a cavalry officer 20 years ago, and there was a substantial reward for his capture. The sheriff's hands trembled as he read the letter again. The irony wasn't lost on him. The man everyone called Cowboy Lonely was actually his own brother, the brother he had believed dead for 2 decades. "Deputy Collins," Morrison called to his young assistant, "gather a posse. We ride at dawn." "Oh, what's the charge, Sheriff?" Collins asked, adjusting his badge nervously. "Murder," Morrison replied grimly, "and harboring a dangerous fugitive." Meanwhile, at the cabin, Lonely was teaching Little Bear how to whittle wood when the boy suddenly looked up from his work. "Tell me about your family," Little Bear asked quietly. "Did you have brothers? Sisters?" Lonely's hand stilled on his own piece of wood. It was a question he had been dreading, yet somehow expecting. "I had a brother once," he said finally. "Younger than me. I was supposed to protect him, but I failed." "What happened?" The older man was quiet for so long that Little Bear thought he wouldn't answer. When Lonely finally spoke, his voice was heavy with old pain. "There was a misunderstanding. A fight. Someone died who shouldn't have, and I had to run. I never saw my brother again." He looked at the boy with eyes full of regret. "That's why I won't let anything happen to you, son. I won't make the same mistake twice." Little Bear reached into his leather pouch and pulled out a small, intricately carved wooden horse. "My father made this for me before he died. He said it would protect me." He held it out to Lonely. "I want you to have it." Lonely's throat tightened as he accepted the gift. "I can't take this, Little Bear. It's too precious." "You gave me something more precious," the boy replied. "You gave me hope." Their moment of connection was interrupted by the thunder of approaching hooves. Through the window, they could see a line of riders cresting the hill, led by a man wearing a sheriff's badge. Lonely's blood ran cold as he recognized the familiar silhouette. "Little Bear," he said urgently, "I need you to hide in the root cellar. No matter what happens, don't come out until I tell you it's safe." "But go! Now!" The boy reluctantly obeyed, disappearing through the trap door just as the riders surrounded the cabin. Sheriff Morrison dismounted slowly, his hand resting on his gun. "William Morrison," he called out, his voice carrying across the yard. "Or should I say Billy? It's been a long time, brother." Lonely stepped onto the porch, his own hand near his weapon. The years fell away as he looked at the man his little brother had become. Harder, colder, but unmistakably family. "Hello, James," Lonely said quietly. "You've grown up." "No thanks to you," Morrison replied bitterly. "You left me alone to deal with the aftermath of what you did. Do you have any idea what I went through after you disappeared? I had no choice. If I'd stayed, you'd have faced justice, like a man should." Morrison's voice cracked with emotion. "Instead, you ran, and I spent 20 years believing you were dead. 20 years mourning a brother who was nothing but a coward and a killer." The words hit Lonely like physical blows, but he stood his ground. "I never killed anyone in cold blood, James. You know that. I know what the witnesses said. I know that Captain Reynolds died by your hand. Reynolds was going to massacre a peaceful Apache village. I couldn't let that happen. So you shot a superior officer and fled like a criminal. The truth hung in the air between them, heavy and painful. Lonely had indeed killed Captain Reynolds, but not for the reasons the official report claimed. He had discovered the captain's plan to attack a defenseless Apache settlement and had tried to stop him. When Reynolds drew his gun, Lonely had been forced to defend himself. But with no witnesses to corroborate his story, he had become a wanted man. "Where's the Apache boy?" Morrison demanded, changing the subject abruptly. "He's under my protection. He's a menace to this community. The town council has voted to have him removed." "Over my dead body." Morrison's face hardened. "That can be arranged?" The tension stretched taut as the two brothers faced each other across 20 years of pain and misunderstanding. The posse members shifted nervously in their saddles, sensing the personal nature of the confrontation. Suddenly, a new voice cut through the standoff. "Sheriff Morrison! Sheriff Morrison!" Young Tommy Fletcher, the telegraph operator's son, came racing up the hill on his pony, waving a piece of paper frantically. "What is it, boy?" Morrison snapped, annoyed at the interruption. "It's a telegram, sir. From the territorial capital. It's about the Apache raids." Morrison snatched the paper and read it quickly, his face growing pale. The telegram contained news that would change everything. A confession from a dying cavalry sergeant who had been present at the incident 20 years ago. The sergeant revealed that Captain Reynolds had indeed been planning an unauthorized attack on peaceful Apache families, and that William Morrison had acted to prevent a massacre. But there was more. The telegram also contained information about recent Apache raids in the area, raids that had been blamed on various Apache groups, but which the territorial government now knew were being carried out by a rogue band of white men disguised as Indians, led by a man named Jake Torino. Morrison's hands shook as he read the final line of the telegram. "Jake Torino, last seen in Dust Rock Valley area. Extremely dangerous. Approach with caution." As if summoned by the mention of his name, the sound of gunfire erupted from the direction of town. Smoke began to rise from the valley below, and the distant screams of terrified townspeople carried on the wind. "The town's under attack!" Deputy Collins shouted. Morrison looked at his brother, 20 years of anger and resentment warring with the immediate need for action. "Can you still shoot straight, Billy?" Lonely's response was to draw his gun and check the cylinder. "Like I never stopped." "Then let's go save our town." As the brothers rode side by side toward the burning settlement, neither of them noticed the small figure that emerged from the root cellar and began following them on foot. Little Bear had heard everything, and he knew that his presence in Dust Rock Valley had somehow brought this danger to the people who had shown him both cruelty and kindness. In his young mind, a plan was forming, a desperate, dangerous plan that would either save the town or cost him his life. But for the first time since his family's death, he felt he had something worth fighting for. He had a home, a protector, and a chance at a real future. He wasn't going to let anyone take that away without a fight. The town of Dust Rock Valley was in chaos. Buildings blazed against the darkening sky as masked riders thundered through the streets, their war cries echoing off the wooden facades. But these weren't Apache warriors. Their movements were too clumsy, their tactics too crude. To anyone who truly knew Apache fighting methods, it was clear these were imposters. Cowboy Lonely and Sheriff Morrison rode hard toward the inferno, their posse trailing behind. As they crested the hill overlooking the town, the full scope of the destruction became apparent. Miller's general store was engulfed in flames, and terrified townspeople ran for cover as the fake raiders continued their assault. "There!" Morrison pointed toward the bank, where several masked figures were loading saddlebags with stolen money. "That's what this is really about. Robbery, not some Apache." "Raid." Lonely's keen eyes spotted something else. "James, look at their horses. Those are cavalry mounts. See the brands?" Morrison squinted through the smoke and swore under his breath. His brother was right. These men were riding stolen military horses, which meant they had connections to the army or were deserters themselves. As they charged into town, Lonely caught sight of the leader of the raiders, a tall man with distinctive silver spurs and a scar running down his left cheek. Even with the bandana covering his face, Lonely recognized him immediately. "Jake Torino," he breathed. Torino had been a sergeant under Captain Reynolds 20 years ago, one of the men who had supported the planned massacre of the Apache village. When Lonely had killed Reynolds to prevent the attack, Torino had been the one to spread the lie that it was cold-blooded murder. Now it all made sense. Torino had been orchestrating these fake Apache raids to steal from frontier towns while deflecting blame onto innocent Native Americans. The battle was fierce but brief. The Morrison brothers fought with the coordination of men who had once been inseparable, their years of separation melting away in the heat of combat. When the smoke cleared, most of Torino's gang lay dead or wounded in the street. But Torino himself had escaped, and he hadn't gone far. Unknown to the brothers, Little Bear had made his way into town during the fighting. The boy had witnessed the entire battle from his hiding place behind the church, and he had seen Torino slip away toward the old mine shaft at the edge of town. More importantly, he had overheard Torino talking to one of his men about a final plan to burn down the church with the townspeople inside, ensuring there would be no witnesses to identify the survivors of his gang. As the townspeople began to emerge from their hiding places, praising the Morrison brothers for their heroism, Little Bear made a fateful decision. He couldn't let innocent people die, even people who had treated him with cruelty and suspicion. The boy slipped away from the crowd and made his way toward the mine shaft, his small size allowing him to move unseen through the shadows. What he found there made his blood run cold. Torino and 3 surviving gang members were preparing bundles of dynamite, planning to blow up the church's foundation and cause it to collapse on the people taking shelter inside. The outlaw leader was ranting to his men about revenge and covering their tracks. "That Morrison boy cost me everything 20 years ago," Torino snarled. "Tonight, I finish what Captain Reynolds started. We'll blame this on the Apache kid. Say he led us to the town. By the time anyone figures out the truth, we'll be long gone with enough money to disappear forever." Little Bear's heart pounded as he realized the full scope of Torino's plan. Not only would innocent people die, but he would be blamed for it, and Cowboy Lonely would be destroyed by the loss of another person he had tried to protect. The boy knew he had to act, but he was outnumbered and outgunned. Then he remembered something his father had taught him about the old mine. It was unstable, held up by rotting wooden supports that could collapse with the right pressure applied in the right place. Moving as silently as a ghost, Little Bear made his way deeper into the mine, past the oblivious outlaws. He found what he was looking for, a key support beam that showed signs of severe rot. If he could weaken it enough, the entire section of the mine would collapse, trapping Torino and his men. Using a sharp rock, the boy began to chip away at the weakened wood, working frantically but quietly. Sweat poured down his face as he raced against time, knowing that at any moment Torino might decide to put his murderous plan into action. Meanwhile, back in town, Lonely had noticed Little Bear's absence. Panic gripped his heart as he searched frantically through the crowd of survivors. "Has anyone seen the Apache boy?" he called out desperately. Mrs. Henderson, her face blackened with soot but her prejudices intact, spat on the ground. "Good riddance. He probably ran off to join his savage friends." But Sheriff Morrison was studying the scene more carefully. "Billy," he said quietly, "look at the tracks leading toward the old mine. Small feet, moving fast." The brothers exchanged a look of understanding and fear. Without a word, they grabbed their rifles and headed toward the mine shaft, their hearts racing with the terrible possibility that Little Bear had walked into mortal danger. Inside the mine, Little Bear's desperate work was paying off. The support beam was nearly severed, but he could hear Torino and his men preparing to leave with their explosives. Time was running out. "Boss," one of the outlaws called, "shouldn't we get moving? That dynamite won't wait forever." "Just a few more minutes," Torino replied. "I want to make sure the timing is perfect. When that church comes down, it'll look like the Apache boys' people came back for revenge." Little Bear made a final, desperate strike at the support beam. The wood cracked with a sound like thunder, and suddenly the entire mine began to shake. Rocks rained down from the ceiling as the boy scrambled toward the entrance, his small size again proving to be an advantage as he squeezed through gaps that would have trapped a grown man. Behind him, he could hear Torino and his men shouting in panic as they realized what was happening. The mine was collapsing, and they were trapped in its depths with enough dynamite to level half the town. Little Bear burst from the mine entrance just as Lonely and Morrison arrived. The boy threw himself into Lonely's arms as the ground shook beneath their feet. "The bad men?" Little Bear gasped. "They wanted to blow up the church. I stopped them." Lonely held the boy tightly, his heart swelling with pride and terror at what could have happened. "You brave, foolish boy," he whispered. "You could have been killed." The mine continued to collapse behind them, sealing Torino and his remaining gang members in their rocky tomb. The threat to Dust Rock Valley was over. But more importantly, the truth about Little Bear was finally about to come to light. As they walked back toward town, Sheriff Morrison put his hand on his brother's shoulder. "Billy," he said quietly, "I owe you an apology. I should have known you weren't capable of cold-blooded murder. You were just a kid, James. You believed what you were told, and I should have believed in my brother instead." The three of them, two brothers reunited and the boy who had brought them together, walked toward the burning town, ready to face whatever came next. But the biggest revelation was still to come, hidden in the leather pouch that Little Bear carried, waiting to transform their understanding of everything that had happened. Dawn broke over Dust Rock Valley like a benediction, painting the smoke-stained buildings in shades of gold and amber. The town had survived the night, but it bore the scars of Torino's attack. As the residents began the work of rebuilding, a different kind of reconstruction was taking place in the Morrison family. Cowboy Lonely sat on the porch of his cabin with Little Bear beside him, watching Sheriff Morrison approach with a telegram in his hand. The boy was exhausted from his heroic actions the night before, but his eyes were bright with something that had been absent for too long: hope. "Billy," Morrison called as he dismounted. "This just came in from the territorial capital. It's about Torino and his gang." Lonely took the telegram and read it aloud. "Jake Torino, former cavalry sergeant, wanted for desertion and multiple counts of robbery and murder. Gang responsible for at least 12 raids blamed on Apache tribes across Arizona territory. Substantial reward offered for information leading to capture." "Well," Lonely said with a grim smile, "I guess that reward belongs to Little Bear here. He's the one who stopped them." Morrison nodded, but his expression remained troubled. "There's something else, Billy. The telegram mentions that Torino was specifically targeting towns with Apache residents. He was trying to stir up hatred between whites and Indians to cover his crimes." Little Bear looked up at both men, his young face serious. "There's something I need to tell you," he said quietly. "Something about why Torino really wanted to hurt me." The boy reached into his leather pouch and pulled out a folded piece of paper, yellowed with age. With trembling hands, he unfolded it and held it out to Lonely. "My mother gave this to me before she died. She said it would help me find my family someday." Lonely took the paper and felt the world shift beneath him. It was a birth certificate, written in both English and Apache script. The child's name was listed as William Little Bear Morrison, and the father's name was William Morrison, U.S. Cavalry. The silence stretched like a taut wire as the implications sank in. Sheriff Morrison leaned over his brother's shoulder to read the document, his face growing pale. "Billy," he whispered, "this means he's my son." Lonely breathed, his voice barely audible. "Little Bear is my son." The boy looked between the two men, confusion and hope warring in his dark eyes. "I don't understand. You're my father?" Lonely's mind raced back 23 years to a time when he was a young cavalry officer stationed near the Apache reservation. He remembered a beautiful Apache woman named Morning Star, who had worked as a translator for the army. They had fallen in love despite the barriers between their worlds, but when she became pregnant, the army had transferred him to another post. He had tried to return to her, but by the time he managed to get leave, she had disappeared with her tribe. "Your mother," Lonely said, his voice thick with emotion, "was her name Morning Star?" Little Bear's eyes widened. "Yes. She told me stories about a soldier with kind eyes who loved her but had to go away. She said he never knew about me." Tears streamed down Lonely's weathered face as 23 years of questions finally found their answers. "I searched for her, son. For months I searched, but the tribe had moved on, and no one would tell me where." Morrison cleared his throat, his own eyes suspiciously bright. "Billy, this changes everything. The boy isn't just under your protection. He's family. He's my nephew." The revelation sent shockwaves through the small group, but it also explained so much. The immediate bond Lonely had felt with Little Bear, the boy's natural courage and integrity, the way they seemed to understand each other without words. It all made sense now. "But why didn't your mother tell you my name?" Lonely asked. Little Bear thought for a moment. "She did, but not the way you think. She always called you Lonely Wolf. She said it was because you were brave and strong, but you walked alone. I never knew it was because people called you Cowboy Lonely." As the morning progressed, more revelations came to light. The townspeople, having witnessed Little Bear's heroism in stopping Torino's final plan, began to see him in a new light. Mrs. Henderson, who had been among his harshest critics, approached the cabin with a basket of food. "I owe you an apology, child," she said, her voice humble. "You saved our lives last night, and I've been nothing but cruel to you." Other townspeople followed, each offering their own apologies and expressions of gratitude. The boy who had been called a curse was now being hailed as a hero, but the most important conversation was yet to come. That evening, as father and son sat by the fireplace, Little Bear asked the question that had been weighing on his heart. "Will you keep me, even though I'm not just some orphan you took pity on?" Lonely pulled the boy close, his heart full to bursting. "Son, I've been looking for you my whole life without even knowing it. You're not going anywhere. We're family now, and family sticks together." "What about Uncle James?" Little Bear asked, using the title naturally. Morrison, who had been listening from the doorway, stepped into the room. "Your Uncle James has some making up to do," he said. "To both of you. I spent 20 years hating my brother for something he didn't do, and I nearly made the same mistake with you." The sheriff sat down across from them, his badge catching the firelight. "Billy, I want you to know, the charges against you have been officially dropped. The territorial governor received the dying sergeant's confession, and combined with what happened here, your name has been cleared completely." Lonely nodded, but his focus remained on his son. "What matters most is that we're together now, all of us." 6 months later, Dust Rock Valley had transformed into a thriving community. The reward money for stopping Torino's gang had been used to rebuild the damaged buildings and establish a school where Little Bear was not only welcomed, but celebrated as one of the brightest students. Cowboy Lonely had taken a job as the town's deputy sheriff, working alongside his brother to keep the peace. The Morrison brothers had become local legends, their story of reconciliation inspiring others to look beyond old prejudices and fears. Little Bear, now calling himself William Morrison, Jr., had grown taller and stronger under his father's care. He still carried his mother's wooden horse, but now it was joined by a new carving, a wolf that his father had made for him, representing the lonely wolf who had finally found his pack. On a warm Sunday evening, the 3 generations of Morrison men sat on the porch of their expanded cabin, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors. The boy was practicing his reading, his voice clear and confident as he worked through a passage from a book about great adventures. "You know," Sheriff Morrison said to his brother, "Ma and Pa would have been proud of how this all turned out." Lonely nodded, his arm around his son's shoulders. "They always said family was the most important thing. Took me 43 years to understand what they meant." Little Bear looked up from his book. "Pa, will you tell me more stories about Ma? About Morning Star? Every night if you want, son. We'll keep her memory alive together." As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, the 3 of them sat in comfortable silence, each lost in their own thoughts about the journey that had brought them together. The boy who had been called a curse had become a blessing. The cowboy who had wandered alone had found his family, and the sheriff who had carried 20 years of anger had discovered the healing power of forgiveness. In the distance, a coyote howled at the rising moon, its voice carrying across the desert like a song of redemption. And in the warm glow of the cabin's windows, 3 hearts that had been broken by loss and separation finally beat as one. The curse had been broken, not by magic or miracles, but by the simple power of love, courage, and the unbreakable bonds of family. In the end, that was the greatest treasure of all, worth more than all the gold in the Arizona Territory, and destined to last for generations to come. They called the Apache boy a curse, until the lone cowboy defied the mob and changed his destiny forever. But in truth, the boy had changed them all, proving that sometimes the greatest blessings come disguised as the things we fear most. And in Dust Rock Valley, where hope had once seemed as scarce as water in the desert, it now flowed as freely as the wind across the open plains, carried on the laughter of a boy who had finally found his way home. Hello, how are you? Did you enjoy the story? Like, share, comment on which city you're watching from, and subscribe to the channel to help us continue adding new amazing videos. Thank you very much and come back often.